guys, welcome to A Taste for Life and welcome to today's video. Am I in eating disorder recovery and are you without even knowing it? So I've been on my eating disorder recovery journey since the beginning of last year and I've had a lot of ups and downs during that time, but I'm in a really different kind of place this time where what I'm doing currently is working for me to the next degree. I've never felt so confident in my recovery ever. But I'm in such a place of contemplation, or I was in such a place of contemplation about if I'm actually in recovery. And there's a lot of question marks, and I'm constantly trying to analyze so I can improve myself and make better choices. But it's such a large question, and I think it's something that I'd really love to explore today with everyone else. Okay, so as usual, let me start with the boring context first, and I just want to really strip this back and start on a really fundamental level. So I want to begin with exploring mental health as just an umbrella term. So what is mental health and what gives a person a mental health diagnosis as opposed to just experiencing symptoms? And the long answer is that it very much depends on every single different type of mental illness. But the short answer is really only dependent on two factors. And that is one, the longevity of the symptoms, and two, the impact that it has on your life and your ability to function day to day. So just to put it in layman's terms, I'm going to use an example of anxiety disorder and depression. So we all get stressed and we all get nervous and we all get sad and lonely, isolated, and a little bit low sometimes for no apparent reason. But that doesn't automatically mean that we have anxiety disorder or depression. The distinguishing in receiving a diagnosis formally comes from those two factors I mentioned. One, being how long have you experienced these symptoms, and two, how much does it impact your day-to-day life? And very generalized and on a surface level, this is also how eating disorders are diagnosed. Now, as with any mental health issue, there are much more complexities than these two factors alone. And especially with eating disorders, where there are many different subtypes, it can get a little bit more complex than what I've just stated. But as a general rule, any mental health disorder diagnosis will stem from those two factors and then also incorporate their own specific symptoms. So let's bring this back to eating disorder recovery and why any of this matters in the first place. When asking myself the question of if I'm in the process of recovering or not, I really wanted to go back to the beginning and kind of look at it from an opposite approach. So instead of looking at the markers of recovery, I wanted to look at the markers of diagnosing an eating disorder. So we've covered the two fundamental blocks of that, but then what are the symptoms listed under each specific subtype of eating disorder? Now, there are a range of different subtypes, as I've said before, and they could be anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, rumination disorder. There are just so many to get into, and I'm not going to touch on them all today because of time, because I'm not a professional, and because my experience is mostly just with anorexia. So I'm going to be talking about that the most. But what you'll find is a lot of the symptoms will overlap with other disorders anyway. And although they present differently, a lot of the criteria come from the same place. So working backwards, I'm going to list the different diagnostic criteria and then evaluate it in reference to my recovery. Now, just quickly before I do that, it's really important to note that not everyone will have recovery goals in each section of the criteria. Not everyone meets each different criteria need, and so their goals may be different. But as a blanket statement, I'm going to cover all of them and link it back to my recovery. So let's begin with bloods. Now, bloods is something that will consistently be reviewed no matter what eating disorder you suffer from. And there's just different tells that bloods can pick up that may not be physically apparent. So, for example, you could have someone in a very regular looking body, has a normal BMI, but when you look at their bloods, their electrolytes are skewed, or their vitamins or minerals are deficient in certain areas. Talking from personal experience, I would constantly have really low white blood cell counts. And for people who have that show up in their bloods and also suffer from anorexia, it's a very distinct piece of evidence that can be used to say that that person is malnourished. So a low white blood cell count doesn't necessarily mean you have an eating disorder and doesn't just present when you're malnourished, but it does show a compromised immune system. And when it's paired with a diagnosis of anorexia, it is very easy to conclude that it's malnourishment that's doing that. So I could have been presenting in a really healthy body, but if that were to show up in my blood work, as well as a suspicion that I already had an eating disorder or I was already diagnosed with an eating disorder, it would be a very telling factor that I'm currently in a malnourished state. So let's look at my bloods and the relation it has to if I'm in recovery or not. Now, I had my bloods tested a couple of weeks ago, and the only deficiencies I have at the moment are phosphate and magnesium, both of which I've been deficient in for extended periods of times. I've been discharged from hospital whilst I was still deficient in magnesium, which seems to constantly be low for some reason. I take my supplements as I need to, and I'm making sure that my diet is consciously got more of those types of foods incorporated into it so I can try and boost my levels naturally as well. But that's something that I'm constantly working on. Like, I'm always going to take the supplements if I know it's low, and I'm always going to reevaluate where I can put it into my meal plan and stuff. But other than that, like, my white blood cell count has been normal for quite a while. I recently got my vitamin D back up to good levels. I've had an iron infusion before, and since that, my iron hasn't dropped down to irregular levels. So I'm going to give myself a big tick for on the track to recovering based on bloods. Okay, so the next diagnostic criteria I'm going to look at is a pretty obvious one. It's weight itself. So this can be categorized into two separate areas. You've got BMI and what your BMI says about you in relation to an eating disorder diagnosis alone. And then you've got your percentage of body fat lost over a consecutive amount of time. So when looking at a diagnosis, BMI alone is mostly used for diagnosing anorexia. So to be considered anorexic, you have to have a BMI below a certain point. And I think that point might be like a BMI of 18 or 17.5, something along those lines. You have to be below that before you're considered anorexic. Now, that is not to say that you can't have anorexic type symptoms before that point of reaching a low BMI, but until you get to that BMI, to have that formal diagnosis, you will be considered an atypical anorexic, which means that you have all the symptoms, you just haven't met that certain criteria yet. And whether you agree with that or not is sort of irrelevant to this conversation. It's kind of just what the guidelines and diagnostic criteria is at the moment. And then the other part of weight contributing to the diagnosis of an eating disorder is how much body fat percentage you've lost over a consecutive period. And I'm pretty sure that it's 10% of body fat loss over 3 months or 15% over 6 months, something along those lines. So if I look at if I'm recovering or not in perspective of these two weight-related elements, first of all, I know my BMI is not exactly where it needs to be. I have been gaining weight and I have been making active choices to increase my BMI, and that is definitely paying off, and it's a tick towards going to the place that I need to be when I'm recovered. And in relation to body fat loss, I have not been losing weight. I have been putting on weight. So that definitely doesn't apply either, which is why I give myself a really big tick towards recovering in the perspective of weight. Now, I do want to mention that I am aware that the weight criteria itself is a little bit finicky. Like, BMI is not the most trusted scale or parameter for criteria in relation to eating disorders, and I can understand that because some people naturally have a larger set point, some have a natural smaller set point, and there's a lot of gray area in this specific criteria. But what I try to like to do when looking at the weight part of it is think about the past evidence I have. Now, I'm both lucky and unlucky that I've had such a long experience in an eating disorder, but it's taught me a lot about my body and my body's needs and the reactions that my body has. So I know roughly a comfortable BMI I should be sitting at, and it may or may not fall into the same category as someone else, and it can and has changed over time. There are a whole bunch of factors that change things like that, but it's about being intuitive to yourself and, definitely seek the advice of professionals and definitely use BMI as a guide. But we know weight and BMI are a little bit more finicky than that. So, it's okay to give yourself flexibility within educated reason. So the next diagnostic criteria I'm going to be looking at is the behaviors themselves. So I'm analyzing this from the perspective of someone who has anorexia nervosa. So the main symptom I'm going to be focusing on is restriction of food. And I'm going to tie this one in to the last criteria I want to talk about, which is the diet and the food that you eat in itself. So this one is a little bit tricky to analyze because what is descriptive as restrictive to one person may not particularly resonate to another. And that's not just within the eating disorder community. And this can even further tie into the other point that I was talking about, which is bloods, because bloods can often be a good indication as to if someone is malnourished. But it actually is a much more broader picture than that. And this is where self-reflection is probably the most key component in realizing if you're restricting and realizing if your meal plan is actually adequate to your needs. And yes, this is usually done with the guidance of a professional, a dietitian, someone who has more specialized knowledge about this. But it also comes back to the patterns of what were you doing before your eating disorder? So when I'm thinking about if I'm in recovery in relation to food and my intake and what my meal plan looks like currently, I look at it this way. The current meal plan that I've put myself on is set to reach a certain amount of calories. Now, calorie counting is not something that is bothersome or an issue to me. I quite like having that information for myself so that I know I'm having a certain amount of calories per day. And that's not to limit it, it's to make sure that I am reaching that specific number. So for me, that's what's working at the moment. But I know that it's also a intelligent plan because it marries specific formulas that I've found online that are used in eating disorder wards and units in calculating how many calories people need on average, just as a guide, guys, in relation to like their height, in relation to their exercise levels, and kind of other little things along the way. So I know I'm at least in the ballpark of where I need to be calorie-wise. But it's also about listening to the response coming from your body. Now, I know I'm making steps towards improvement because I'm not feeling as lethargic. I don't feel dizzy. I don't find myself backing out of social events because I just don't have the energy to put into those activities. And these are all useful markers in knowing that my body is receiving what it needs. But aside from that, just looking at the way I've devised my meal plan this time, it is very different to the way it even looked in a hospital. It's different in a hospital environment. They only have so many options to offer you. And coming from a fussy eating background anyway, it was very hard for me to make choices when I was on the ward just because of taste and textual preferences. But I have finally figured out a way to incorporate the foods I like in a sensible and healthy manner, in a way that is going to nourish my body and get the most out of my diet despite being a fussy eater. So if I give myself recovery tics in furthering myself from all these diagnostic criteria, why is it that I'm still questioning whether I'm in recovery or not? And essentially, the answer comes down to recovery is different for everyone. So again, this is something I've spoken about previously, but right now in the eating disorder recovery community, there is a massive push for all-in recovery. And essentially, that just means that people are taking on different challenges and pushing themselves to the extremes against their eating disorder. So, for example, it wouldn't be uncommon to see these types of content creators do challenges like 10,000 calories a day or facing my audience's fear foods. But is that what true recovery is? And the answer is yes, sometimes for some people. Look, I think the only representation we're getting at the moment is this type of recovery. And I take particular issue to one creator that I watch in particular. Now, I really like her content. I think she's putting out some amazing things, but this certain creator is a little bit different. She has abs. She does training every single day. She's currently training for a marathon. Like, it's not typically what you'd see on these anorexia recovery channels. However, it doesn't invalidate her experience. She's taking a different approach. And I would keep in mind, as someone viewing these content creators' pages, not to make such negative comments so hastily. Like, you may not agree with their recovery path, and you don't have to. They don't need verification from you. They don't need to justify themselves over and over again. And she has often explained that she has been in recovery for a year before she started training again, and that she naturally has a more slender body, and that fitness was a part of her life before her eating disorder. So if we look at it in the perspective of her life, that's actually very valid for her to be doing these things. Now, would it be valid for someone else? Not necessarily. But for her, who's had a healthy relationship with exercise before her eating disorder, it makes sense that once she's in a place of healing and being recovered, that she's allowed to return to it. And she should be able to do that without being accused of actually still being in an eating disorder. Hearing those little snickering comments about, like, that's not recovery behavior, or that's not recovery, what recovery should look like, can deflate a person. You don't know what their eating disorder really looks like. For as much content as they'd put out there, you don't have the full story, so you can't make those kind of comments. All you can do is unfollow, take a step back, and look at something else. Now, speaking as someone who's tried a variation of an all-in approach in my recovery process, I know that it's just not what works for me. Like, I've tried to do it on my own in the sense that, you know, I'll eat whatever my body is craving. I'll do it to the amounts that it wants. And that often led me to a very unpredictable path, which is fine when I'm a more intuitive eater. But there would be days where I knew I was getting way less calories than I needed. And there were days where I was getting more than probably what my body needed. And you may think that that all balances out naturally anyway. But the mental impact it was having on me always put me back to a mindset of restriction. So it was best that I not do it that way. It was an approach that did not work for me. I talk a lot about the all-in approach not working for me, but I still watch it all the time. I still think it's very entertaining. I still think it's very fun. And I still love seeing how effectively it works for some people, because it truly does. And just because it's not the approach I'm taking, it doesn't mean that I can't admire how much it's working for someone else. Now, writing out my meal plans based on calories and based on nutrients means that I am very aware of what is in my food. I'm very aware of how much I'm consuming, and to a lot of people that would be triggering and feed into their eating disorder. But for me, it doesn't. Now, if I put that out on the internet and were as big as some of these creators, I know the backlash I would get would be so harsh. But I think we need to remember the fact that a lot of people within the eating disorder community come from a perfectionistic place. And that's a little bit stereotypical, but it is a common trait that's associated with people who have eating disorders. And one of the things about perfectionist type of people is that we can often have very black and white thinking. I need to keep it in perspective of myself. I'm doing it in the most sensible way that is also compassionate to the fact that I just have a lot of different eating requirements and a lot of different eating preferences, even before my eating disorder. And again, that's what it comes down to. What were you like before your eating disorder? Now, these people are doing 10,000 a day calories challenges. And unless it's a goal for them to be doing that in the future, it's not something that you need to do to tick the recovering or recovered box. Now, I don't think it's a terrible thing to do. If that is what's going to prove to your eating disorder that you are progressing and that you're not listening to it, then fantastic. Go ahead and do it. And from the looks of it, a lot of people are getting a lot out of it. But it doesn't mean that it's going to work for everyone, and it's not a marker of recovery for every single person. Only you know your specific mindset, and only you know truly what your intentions are when you're setting out your recovery path. Everything is a learning curve, and even setbacks can be useful in the recovering space because you learn what works for you, you learn what doesn't work for you. But what I never want to see is someone feeling invalidated or like they're not recovering or recovering properly just because it doesn't look like someone else's. Look at it in the perspective of your life. If it's going to be something that's bothersome to you at one point or another, then I'd say work on it and make it a recovery goal. If it's something that's just trendy at the moment, then is it really that important you achieve it? Maybe yes, maybe no. Only you can answer that. But don't let what's trending at the moment be a marker for your recovery. Look at what you were like before your eating disorder. Look at the goals that you have for the future and look at how your body responds to what you're doing. Those are more important factors than anything else. So let's just all keep supporting each other in a space that is meant to be about empowerment, and let's all focus on ourselves a little bit as well and figure out what we specifically need. It's really all a you do you approach. So I'm sorry this was a bit long, guys. I know I ramble on a little bit, but I do feel like this is really, really important. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope this validates what part of the process of recovery you're at, but really, only you will know that. So I will talk to you guys soon. Have a great day.